Here's a good example of some poison ivy. You will see there are 3 leaves on each stem. That's one important characteristic to look for. Here's another. Sometimes the leaves fall off or get eaten, as in this example here where there's just 2, but if you look around you'll see there's 3 leaves on many others. Poison ivy can grow up the side of a tree like this, just like an ivy. It can also just grow on the ground. Here's some poison ivy down here also. Again, notice the 3 leaves. The leaves tend to be fairly smooth on the edges. They're not jagged or serrated, but the overall shape of the leaf can change a little bit. Notice the outline of this leaf right here compared to the outline of this leaf down here. This leaf has some kind of spikes, kind of edges sticking out right there, whereas the leaf right next to it does not. So you will see that kind of a variation. Poison ivy often grows up the sides of trees, and if it's been allowed to grow for a long time, the vines start becoming almost hairy, as they have these fine little fibers growing out of the side that grip to the tree and hold the vine in place. I see just 1 leaf here. I see just 1 leaf on this one and 2 leaves here. But it's fall. Leaves are beginning to fall. And so I want to look over the entire plant before I make any conclusions about whether or not this is poison ivy. And as you can see, if I stand back a little bit and look at the entire plant, I can see a lot of leaves that are grouped in 3s. And in fact, this is poison ivy. In addition to the leaves, this furry part that you see growing onto the tree there, it also tells me that this is indeed poison ivy, and I should avoid touching it. Here's another example of poison ivy growing on a tree. At first glance, it almost blends in and it's hard to notice. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, you can see the distinctive hairy fibers growing out of the side of this vine here and grabbing onto the tree. Here's a cluster of different plants growing on the ground right here. Is there any poison ivy in here? Let's take a closer look. Look at these leaves here. Somewhat similar to poison ivy in appearance, but if you look at the number of leaves on each little stem there, you'll see there's 5. Poison ivy does not contain 5 leaves on a stem, just 3. So this is not poison ivy. This would be safe for me to touch. Here's something over here. No groups of 3. The leaves don't look very similar to poison ivy. Look down here though, what do you see? This is a good example of a poison ivy plant. Here's a rock that's covered with vines. First thing I'm going to think of when I see anything that's covered with vines, I'm going to think about, could this be poison ivy? Should I try to not touch this for any reason? As I look closely, I see this part of the rock here is covered with a vine where the leaves appear to be somewhat individual. They're not clumped together in groups of 3. This is in fact another example of bittersweet. So the rock seems to be safe for me if I wanted to climb up on it or something, until I get down to this part here. And now I notice that within all this bittersweet, there's something else growing. Something that I didn't notice at first. That's right. This is in fact poison ivy here. So even though at first glance this rock seems harmless and a good candidate for clambering up, I probably would want to avoid this rock to avoid catching a rash from the poison ivy. At first glance you might think this is poison ivy. It looks like groups of 3 leaves. But if we look a little bit more closely, we can see 2 tiny leaves on the bottom of these plants. This is not poison ivy. This plant is safe to handle. Here's another plant that I might mistake for poison ivy, but is actually fairly harmless. You'll see it has the clusters of 3 leaves that look just like poison ivy. The leaves are a little bit serrated at the edges. The edges aren't smooth, so that's one difference. But another important difference with this plant is that on the underside, although you probably can't see it in here, but you could feel it, there are tiny little thorns. Poison ivy does not have thorns. So this plant, which is a type of bramble, probably blackberry, is relatively harmless. Here's another example of a bramble. Poison ivy look-alike that is in fact harmless. At first glance you might think this is poison ivy. It looks like groups of 3 leaves. But if we look a little bit more closely, we can see 2 tiny leaves on the bottom of these plants. This is not poison ivy. This plant is safe to handle. Can you spot any poison ivy in this area here? How about now?